This is Jeremy with Cryoclarity, and in this video, I'm going to be going over this eye model, talking about the different muscles, glands, sacs, and different nuclei and reflexes associated with it. So if we consider this eye model, this is how it would be placed within the skull. Therefore, this is a left eye, and therefore this can help give orientation with some of these structures. The optic nerve is this big white portion, which is cranial nerve 2, which contains sensory fibers only, and it has no nucleus associated with it. So aside from the optic nerve being sensory only, it is also going to have no nucleus associated with it, just like the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve 1. So the optic nerve is always going to be posterior to the eye, and that generally makes sense, and most people can grasp that concept. Furthering the orientation, the lacrimal gland is always going to be a superior lateral structure on the eye, with the lacrimal sac being medial. So as we have established some of that orientation, we can also see that this is the superior rectus muscle, and the superior oblique muscle is not illustrated on this model, unfortunately, but the inferior oblique muscle is. So now we can continue to talk about these different muscles and more about the lacrimal gland and lacrimal sac. Starting with the lacrimal gland, it is innervated by cranial nerve V1 and 7. So V1 is the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, therefore it makes sense that the lacrimal gland can be innervated by cranial nerve V1. And the specific ganglion associated with the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve innervating the lacrimal gland is going to be the pterygopalatine ganglion. Now the lacrimal gland, aside from being innervated by cranial nerve V1, is also innervated by 7, the facial nerve, and that is similar to the cornea of the eye. The cornea of the eye shares the same innervation that the lacrimal gland does, which is going to be cranial nerve V1 and 7. And that's going to come into play as we talk about the corneal blink reflex. The corneal blink reflex is whenever an object touches the cornea of the eye and the response, or the reflexive response, is to blink. That involves both of those cranial nerves. V1 sensing the actual object touching the cornea on the eye, as V1 provides the sensory or afferent innervation to the cornea, and that afferent or sensory innervation of the cornea is associated with the spinal nucleus of 5. As the spinal nucleus of 5 senses things such as pain and temperature of the face. So with an object touching the cornea, cranial nerve V1 is going to sense it and send fibers to the spinal nucleus of 5, which then will send fibers to the facial nucleus, which then goes to the facial nerve and activates the orbicularis oculi muscle to blink. So the corneal blink reflex is associated with 2 cranial nerves, V1 and 7. It's associated with the trigeminal ganglion because it's associated with cranial nerve V1, which is one of the divisions of the trigeminal nerve. And it's also associated with 2 nuclei, the spinal nucleus of 5 and the facial nucleus, and also associated with 1 main muscle, the orbicularis oculi. Furthermore, if we talk about more reflexes associated with the eye, if we were to shine a light, if this probe acted as a light source and we were shining light directly into the eye, that would activate cranial nerve 2, because cranial nerve 2 gives us the sense of sight. So cranial nerve 2 would sense the light, and then it would send fibers back, and being since 2 has no nucleus, there will be no nucleus associated with the cranial nerve 2 and in the pupillary light reflex, but there is a nucleus associated whenever cranial nerve 3 comes into play. As we know, if we shine light into the eyeball, we will get pupillary constriction, which is termed miosis. And that miosis, or that pupillary constriction, is thanks to cranial nerve 3, and specifically the parasympathetic nervous system innervation associated with cranial nerve 3, and therefore the parasympathetic nucleus of cranial nerve 3, which is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So the pupillary light reflex involves cranial nerve 2 to sense the light and cranial nerve 3 to give a reflexive response. Therefore, it also involves the ciliary ganglion, as that is the parasympathetic nervous system ganglion associated with cranial nerve 3, and therefore associated with the parasympathetic Edinger-Westphal nucleus of cranial nerve 3. Fibers from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus will project to the ciliary ganglion before projecting to the sphincter pupillae muscle, which would then allow us to constrict the eyeball. Now, we went over the pupillary light reflex and the corneal blink reflex, but there's also an accommodation-convergence reflex. And that reflex is if we had a pin far out, or a pencil, or even in this case, a probe in front of the patient, and we were to bring it to their nose. So we know that that is a simple trick as kids to create or make someone go cross-eyed, but that is actually an accommodation-convergence reflex. So that involves cranial nerve 3 only, but it involves both nuclei associated with cranial nerve 3, both the Edinger-Westphal and the oculomotor nuclei, in which the oculomotor nucleus is the motor nucleus and the Edinger-Westphal is the parasympathetic nucleus. So therefore, since it involves the Edinger-Westphal or parasympathetic nucleus, it will also involve the parasympathetic ganglion, being the ciliary ganglion, as we discussed before. So with accommodation convergence, as that object comes closer, our eyes will turn in medially, and that will be due to the action of the medial rectus muscle, which is innervated by cranial nerve 3, and since it is motor, associated with the oculomotor nucleus. However, our eyes will also constrict, just as they did whenever we shine light into it, and that will involve the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the ciliary ganglion, as well as the sphincter pupillae muscle once again, and that gives us convergence. Therefore, as an object gets closer, we accommodate and converge the eyes, but not only do we converge, we constrict. And not only do we constrict, but the lens gets rounder or more convex. So the accommodation convergence reflex is associated with cranial nerve 3 only, but associated with the ciliary ganglion, as it is associated with the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the oculomotor nucleus as well. So the one cranial nerve, both nuclei of that cranial nerve, and therefore the ganglion associated with the nuclei of that cranial nerve, in which we only have the ciliary ganglion, and the way in which we remember the actions that occur at the eye with the accommodation convergence reflex is by the 3 C's. Constriction, also known as meiosis, thanks to the sphincter pupillary muscle, as well as the ciliary ganglion and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Convergence, thanks to the action of the medial rectus muscle and the oculomotor nucleus, but also ciliary muscle contraction leading to a convex lens. So there are a bunch of C's being thrown around, but the main 3 we need to remember are constriction, convergence, and a convex lens. So as the ciliary muscle contracts, the ligaments relax and the lens becomes more convex or round. So the 3 C's for accommodation, or even better, the 3 C's for close up. So that will conclude talking about the reflexes associated with the eye. Now we can get into more of the actual visual anatomy and muscular structures with it. So we did talk about the optic nerve being cranial nerve 2, sensory only with no nucleus. The lacrimal gland being innervated by cranial nerve V1, therefore associated with the pterygopalatine ganglion, and the spinal nucleus of 5, as well as it has a joined or shared innervation with cranial nerve 7. The lacrimal sac collects tears that the lacrimal gland formed, not directly from it, but as we form tears with the lacrimal gland, and those go and onto the eyeball, they will then drain into the lacrimal sac. So the lacrimal sac is a reservoir for tears that were previously produced by the lacrimal gland before the lacrimal sac is drained by the nasolacrimal duct into the inferior nasal meatus, which is contained within the nasal cavity. So if you haven't already, you can go and check out the video on the nasal cavity where we talked about some of the anatomy and some of those paranasal sinuses and different drainage points with the nasal meatuses. Lacrimal gland, lacrimal sac. This is the superior rectus muscle, and usually the superior rectus muscle is covered or just inferior to another muscle called Levator Palpebrae superioris. Levator Palpebrae superioris is superior to the superior rectus muscle because its action is to elevate the upper eyelid. So the eyelid, or specifically the upper eyelid, sits superior to the actual eye itself. So a muscle that acts on the actual eye itself, being superior rectus, is going to be inferior to a muscle that acts on a structure superior to the eye, in which that would be Levator Palpebrae superioris, acting on the upper eyelid, elevating it to help us open our eyes. Therefore, if there is damage to Levator Palpebrae superioris, or the nerves that innervate it, which there are two separate innervations, then we could get ptosis, or drooping of the eyelid. Levator Palpebrae superioris has two different innervations. It is divided into an upper bank and a lower bank. The upper bank of Levator Palpebrae superioris, commonly abbreviated LPS, is going to be innervated by cranial nerve 3 via the oculomotor nucleus, as that is the motor or efferent nucleus associated with cranial nerve 3. Therefore, it makes sense that that nucleus would be associated with innervating muscles. The lower bank of the LPS muscle is going to be innervated by the superior cervical ganglion off the sympathetic trunk. So since cranial nerve 3, specifically with the oculomotor nucleus, innervates half of the LPS, cranial nerve 3 is associated with innervating 4.5 out of 7 of the extrinsic or extraocular eye muscles, although it is truly associated with innervating 4 out of 6 extrinsic or extraocular eye muscles, as Levator Palpebrae superioris is not considered one, but we just throw it into the mix here because it's easier to group. So Levator Palpebrae superioris is superior to the superior rectus muscle that we see here, and it is innervated by cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, as well as the sympathetic or the superior cervical ganglion off the sympathetic trunk. Now the 4 extraocular or 4 true extrinsic eye muscles that cranial nerve 3 is associated with, other than the superior rectus being one, is going to be the middle rectus, the inferior rectus, and the inferior oblique muscles. Now the inferior oblique muscle, it is unique because its actions are going to be to extort, elevate, and abduct the eye. So the inferior rectus muscle, whenever it works, it extorts, elevates, and abducts the eye. And the superior oblique is going to be kind of opposing it in a way, in which it will depress, intort, but still abduct the eye. That's why it doesn't oppose it fully, but just in a way, because the superior oblique helps to intort and depress the eye, whereas the inferior oblique helps to extort and elevate the eye, but they both act to abduct the eye. So superior rectus, middle rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique are all innervated by cranial nerve 3 via the oculomotor nucleus. Then that bears the question of what the other muscles are innervated by. The superior oblique muscle that we did mention that is not shown here, unfortunately, that muscle is innervated by cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, and that's easy to remember because the superior oblique muscle actually runs within a trochlea or a pulley before it attaches to the eye, and that helps give it the action of intorsion, depression, and abduction. So the superior oblique is one of the two exceptions of the extrinsic or extraocular eye muscle innervations, and the lateral rectus is the other one. The lateral rectus is innervated by the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6. And it's unique because lateral rectus works with medial rectus on each eyeball. So if the left lateral rectus was working to bring our left eyeball to look laterally to the left, then the medial rectus muscle on the right eyeball would be working to bring the eye in the same direction. And this mutual working of cranial nerve 6 on the left and cranial nerve 3 on the right is helped via, or it is allowed via, the medial longitudinal fasciculus. That connects one oculomotor nucleus to one abducens nucleus, specifically on either sides of the body, allowing for horizontal gaze. So to give a quick overview, because we did talk about a lot, not only what we can see here, but other things associated with just looking at this eye model. To give an identification overview, we have the optic nerve, which has no motor or no nuclei. So it has no motor innervation and no nuclei associated with it. The optic nerve here is the superior rectus, which usually we have the Levator Palpebrae superioris muscle superior to it because it acts on a superior structure, with that structure being the upper eyelid, whereas superior rectus acts on the eye itself. Here is the lacrimal gland, innervated by cranial nerve V1 and 7, the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, and the facial nerve, respectively, just as the cornea of the eye is also innervated by those two cranial nerves. The lacrimal gland produces tears that, after going onto the eyeball, drain into the lacrimal sac before the lacrimal sac is drained by the nasolacrimal duct into the inferior nasal meatus. Here we have the lateral rectus muscle, which is innervated by cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve. Here is the medial rectus muscle, which is again innervated by the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, just like superior rectus. And if we flip it over to the underside, we can see the inferior rectus and the inferior oblique muscles, which are both innervated by cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve. That concludes looking at this eye model, not only the structure seen here, but different reflexes and important notations associated with it.